When I start a guitar project, I always make a full-scale drawing so that I can see what I'm doing as the steps go by. Once I get a nice 100% drawing all penciled out, I start selecting woods. So pulling body woods out. So I look at all the basic woods that I'm going to use for the body, make sure that they're not twisted or anything, so that they will glue together pretty well. I joint them on a jointer. Get them ready to glue them together to become one big fat block of wood. I'm using Sapele. These are about 22 inches long. They're about 2 inches thick. Once I get them all lined up, put down a little piece of plastic paper, wax paper. I use regular yellow wood glue. Spread it with my index finger. That's very important. You gotta use your index fingers. It's the best way to spread glue. And bar clamps and little hold downs on the ends to keep them flat and in position with one another. I leave that for about a day. Come back and remove the clamps, take off the bar clamps, and get rid of some of the glue squeeze out that is always present. Because I don't want that blank going through a sander and loading up the sandpaper with glue. So I try to get rid of scrape off the glue, and then I send it through the thickness sander, get it down to a nominal working thickness that is going to be the basic thickness for the body. Go back to the body, and then once the body blank is done, I start working on the neck. I select the woods, select the neck dimensions on the drawing, and then start putting together all the component pieces. I typically make necks out of several laminations. This one's going to be 7 laminations altogether. I'm using Padauk, which is a very red-colored wood in the center, and we'll talk about the other layers in a minute. What I'm making here is a wedge on a kind of a jig that I use that expands or kind of pushes the wood through the table saw at an angle. This will be a very critical piece of tooling that I'll use to create wedged pieces of wood that will actually make the neck get a little wider towards the heel and a little narrower towards the nut. This center piece of Padauk that I'm cutting is, you can see the wedge shape. It's going to be wider at one end than the other. See, the little tip is very thin, and I'll sand that tip down till it's just feather thin, and that will become the very center part of the neck. So it's going onto the wedged board, running it through the sander, and once that's done, the tip of that thing it just disappears. It goes down to basically zero. Lining up the different pieces of the neck, I find that I then have to take the 2 outside billets, the 2 big chunks of flamey maple, and chamfer the top ends. Where the center piece, the center wedge, goes to 0, the 2 outer pieces, the big white maple pieces, will collide. They need to have a little bit taken off, so that right at this point, the 2 top parts then recede on either side. Preparing to glue together the neck assembly, I'll put down a little wax paper to keep the whole thing from sticking to the glue-up board. I've got a couple of big fat clamping cauls that will provide a kind of a spread of the tension throughout instead of clamping directly to the neck bits. This neck will be 7 individual pieces, 2 large chunks of curly maple on the outside, 2 darker strips of imbuya, a small pinstripe of maple about 10 thousandths thick, and the center wedge of Padauk. You can see that red Padauk is this shorter piece in the center there. The little 10 thousandths pieces of maple will give kind of a little accent stripe between the dark brown imbuya and the reddish Padauk. There's the Padauk, and there's a little thin piece of maple right there. Then the imbuya. 7 pieces altogether. I'll apply clampage with the bar clamps, the short bar clamps. Wood glue has kind of a long open time, so there's no hurry in doing this. Put a Delrin block at either end to keep the thing from slipping around. Then I'll put a Delrin block on top of the whole assembly and some couple of cam clamps to keep everything from shifting out of register. And when we end up, we'll have a nice clean top and bottom billet made of 7 different pieces. There's an awful lot of moisture going into this assembly with the wood glue being what it is. So in the following day, I'll flip it and pull off the wax paper, scrape away any kind of gooey wood glue that's still gooey, and then reclamp it and set it outside. This is Southern California, and it's pretty dry down here. So during the day, I'll put it outside. I'll take it back inside during the night, of course. But I'll leave it outside for 5 days or more. Sometimes I let necks sit for a month or even longer to stabilize. In this instance, I'm satisfied that it's dry enough anyway to work on. And I'll clean it up on the jointer and on the table saw. And it's in its real rough state right now, but clean enough to get on to the next step, which is the truss rod. I use stainless 1032 rod for a truss rod. I get these little, what do you call them? Just these little barrels, 1032 barrels that will anchor the truss rod inside the neck. I cut it to length, and I use little brass, chrome-plated brass nuts that are real long. They got a lot of threads in them. They're longer than a regular nut. I like those for my truss rod nuts. And then I'm going to cover the truss rod with 2 layers of shrink wrap, because the truss rod itself, the 1032 rod, is only 0.09 inches thick. It has to be 0.25 inches thick to fit snug in the truss rod slot. So I'll cover it with a couple of layers of rubber or vinyl, whatever that stuff is. And you can see 0.246 is just shy of 2.250, which is what the truss rod slot will be once it's routed. Check for fit. Just mark up the areas where the truss rod's going to go, particularly the barrel. Cut a 3/8 inch or drill a 3/8 inch hole for the barrel assembly. And then I get on to the truss rod slot itself. Put the neck blank inside of 2 outrigger holders. Keep it in register. Turn it over, and there's the hole for the little barrel. Line up this router guide. This guide will enable me to run the router up and down the neck and make the truss rod slot. So I line it up centerwise and lengthwise. Do a few calculations to make sure I make the slot deep enough but not too deep, so that when I carve the neck, I don't carve through the back of it too far and expose the truss rod trench. I have my trusty Bosch trim router. Those things are a real pain in the butt. The base just is murder to get on and off. So now you can see my my router burning its way through the process of making the truss rod slot. I should get new 1/4 inch router bits, but I'm too cheap to do it. Clean it up with a little sanding board. Press it in, and it needs to be gently tapped into place. Put in a little wood glue either side, and then a quarter inch strip, 0.250 strip of maple. Glue it in, leave that for a day. A lot of friends of mine, woodworker friends, make fun of me for using these cheap little Harbor Freight bar clamps, but they're really pretty handy. They work pretty well for certain applications. Now it's the peg head wings. So the peg head needs to be wider than the shaft is now. So I take a couple of short blanks of flamey maple and soak them with wood glue. And put a couple of hand screw clamps, four hand screw clamps to be sure, to be precise. And leave that for a day. Take them off the following day and cut away the excess on the back so I could do more work on the neck. The truss rod slot excess has to come off. Now I gotta get that to be flat. Trim up the trim up the top of the peg head, and trim off the excess of the faceplate of the peg head. Now it's starting to look like a neck. I take my little Lee Nielsen low angle block pilling. I'm very proud of that because I spent so much money on it. It's a very cool little tool. And then I go to the Neanderthal method of shaping and finessing my peg head. This is really a bad way to do things because it heats the wood, and there's a very high likelihood that the neck will be sanded badly, not square, the wrong thickness, but I get good results. Now I'm making a ruler for the fretting operation. You can get fret markings from the web all over the place. I use a aluminum ruler, set the marks, and score this ruler so that I have all the individual fret positions marked on the back side of this ruler. The ruler will be used a little later when I'm doing the slots.
Here we have a teeny tiny fret sliding blade. Teeny tiny. Make sure the kerf goes the right way.
You can get these little fretting blades from LMI or from StewMac. This sled, is so-called, is a little table saw device that you can use to push things through the blade. And as you can see, I use the ruler that has the fret markings on it. It's hard to see the fretboard in there, but what I'm doing is positioning the fretboard against the ruler where the markings are, and then I run it through the blade. And at the end, I get my nice 22 slots across that board. That board is still square, and I have to cut the shape to fit the neck now, the profile of the neck. So I use tape to see the line real closely, and then trim it off. Get the edges trimmed off of the fretboard. This is flamey walnut, some old chunks of flamey walnut. This guitar is going to have Pedauque binding, so I cut binding strips. I thickness them on the sander, and I'll put 2 strips along the length of the fretboard, 2 pieces of Pedauque binding. I think they call this bloodwood as well. I use a couple of cauls, clamping cauls on the outside. You can see I've aligned the clamping caul with packing tape so that it doesn't, if it gets glue on it, doesn't stick to the workpiece. I can give that a couple of hours and it's dry. And then dots come next, marker dots, fingerboard dots. I use a 1/4-inch Forstner bit, and with the positions marked out and punched along the fretboard so I don't make any mistakes in terms of the centering and the positioning. Here's the 12th fret right there with 2 marker dots. And for each position I drill, I check them to make sure that they're about the right depth. And fill them with CA glue, cyanoacrylate glue, 2 at a time, because I'm always worried about the CA seizing up before I can get the dots in there. I'm using Power dots. PowerShell. And then get out my lovely block plane and finesse that binding on both front and back of the binding. Gluing up the fretboard on the neck requires positioning. You can see these little nails I'm pounding in. There, those 2 nail holes that are located in fret slots will enable me to keep the neck in position as I apply all this clamping pressure. Otherwise, if you didn't have something that held the neck in place independent of the clamps, that thing would just be swimming around. A day later, I'll pull the nails. You can see those slots there. And those nail holes will get covered up once I put the frets on. Cut the end of the neck to length, finesse it on the sander, and then cut away a little bit of the flaming maple, walnut at the end to make room for the end cap of the binding. Chamfer the edges at 45, and then play with it until I can get that last piece on the end sized up properly and glued into place. At this point, I try to wrap my projects up when I'm not working on them and put them away somewhere so that they're safe and they don't get damaged, because I've got too many hours in them at this point to not do that. It's fretboard radius time. I'll put a 16-inch radius on the neck using a curved block, a block that is made at 16 inches with sanding paper on it. Do that a few thousand times and you have a nice rounded fingerboard. And now it's time for frets. I use a punch to put frets in. I have pounded them in with hammers. It works pretty well. I'm terrible at fretting, but it gets done and the guitar plays okay at the end. Cut them all to length and then cut the little tangs off of the area that will overhang the binding so it doesn't crush the binding once you punch it in. Run up and down the neck with that punch, with that press. Clip off the little overhanging ends and then sand them. A lot more work goes in than I'm going to show, but basically I start by sanding them and then sanding the edges down at a 45 and then using a fret finishing file to begin the process of cleaning up the edges of the frets. I'll put in side markers using aluminum rod for the marking material. Just drill little holes in the proper positions to coordinate with the dots that are on the fretboard, and use CA glue again to put the aluminum rods in. I have to get my glasses on so I can see the rod going in. Clip it off, let the glue dry, and come back and file those down flush after they're dry with a file. I follow that up with a sanding block to get them nice and flush with the edge of the binding. I'm going to cut 5 little strips of Wenge for the peghead overlay. These 5 little strips will get glued together to become a 4-inch wide plate, which will be the lowest layer on the peghead. Just flood it with CA glue, and it'll be ready to work real fast. Of course, you need activator for that. Once you apply that activator, the glue sets, and you can get to work on the assembly right away. Of course, using the proper amount of materials is probably ideal. Once I clean up that mess, I prepare a small part of that plate for my hot stamp machine where I'll put my name on the peghead plate. This little hot stamp machine is really, really old. And you can see I can get my name stamped in it in silver. Make the second layer of the peghead by taking strips of maple, cutting them to size to form a W shape, and fit binding to those little crevices. Once I end up with that little peghead plate, I clean it up with a sanding block, and fit the rest of the binding to the outer parts, and then glue it up to the Wenge plate. You'll see me tap in a couple more nails to keep it in position. Those nails will be cut off later because they're outside of the area of the final piece, but they'll keep the work piece in position with the layer below it. Mark off the peghead transition curves there. Cut them away on the bandsaw. Check them for fit first. Cut away the excess, and then sand it down nice and accurately. I have to bend a couple of pieces of pedalk on the hot pipe to get them to fit those little transition areas, peghead transitions. Glue them up, and glue up the little outside binding. Snip it off, chop off the excess parts, and there's the peghead overlay. Check it for fit, admire it, get excited about it. Tape it up for position to drill holes for the truss rod slot cover. And those 3 holes will enable me to keep the peghead in position when I'm gluing it to the peghead itself. So you can see I'm screwing them in position. Put a clamping caul over that. You can see the clamping caul has 3 holes to correspond, which enables the screws to sit there. Once it's all dry, I can start cutting away the excess material on the on the neck. It's kind of a wasteful part of the process, but I haven't figured out how to. I mean, I could tool up and build some tools that will enable me to use less wood when I build a neck. But I'm making these multi-part necks, and the peg head is basically one part of the build, and I just prefer doing it like this. So it is a waste of wood, but eventually I'll figure out how to do it better. Cut away the wings on the peg head, the excess part of the wings, sand them flat and flush. And then start my Neanderthal method of cleaning up the heel for thickness and the peg head. You can see how awful this is. It's just a really horrible way to do this, but it's the way I do it. Sand back the peg head transition area, and then finesse that with a portable drum sander, sort of a medium-sized one, and then switch to a small one. And get that little area to clean up there. Once that's done, I can start carving the neck. I start with a drum sander with a really rough, I think this is like a 30 grit drum on there. And I just try to hog off as much material as I can. You can see it's starting to round over. Then I switch to a hand rasp and spend a couple hours just carefully scraping away and checking it with a ruler for straight edge and checking thickness and making sure I don't go too far. Then I finish up with a sander, a rotary sander. For the back of the peg head, I'm going to put 2 layers on. A layer of Pedalc. It's about less than 20 thousandths. Spread a little glue with my special glue spreading apparatus, and put a curved caul with a sort of a flexible curved tip on it that will, push down that rounded area in the volute. And I inspect it with my zircon encrusted inspection glasses. Now a layer of walnut for the backstrap.
I look how you can even see through them. They're like nothing to them. There's like 0.020, something like that. Like paper thin.
Those 2 pieces are book matched, so the pattern is kind of cool down the center. Glue it up. Following morning, pull off that wax paper. Cut away some of the excess with a knife, cutting towards my fingers, which is just not the greatest way to do it in terms of safety. And start cutting the holes for the tuners, and then enlarging them with a reamer. I just like to put the tuners on at a point like this just to see how they look and to see if I made the correct decision about where to put them. In fact, I didn't. Well, I did because they're in the correct position, but they look kind of stupid sticking out that far, but whatever. Now we can start on the body. We'll just set the neck aside, let it cool for a few days. I'm going to hog out a lot of the inner area of the body blade. This is going to be a chambered instrument, so it'll be a solid body bass guitar, but the inside really won't be entirely solid. The inside's going to be pretty much entirely empty. That's just basically for weight concerns. Otherwise, this guitar would probably weigh about 30 pounds. Truly, about 30 pounds. So this is Sapele material. And I cut away strategic areas that need to be removed or can be removed. And I leave solid areas like the neck block and the area where the bridge will rest because they're going to need some support. I'm going to make a router template that will be used to guide the router using brass collars on the router itself, and clean up the cavity in the guitar, so the bass will have nice clean cavities, and the walls of the cavities will be cleaned up nice and look nice. Not that it matters because nobody's going to look inside, but that's what it is. Cut away the electronics access door there on the back side of the instrument. And that's what it looks like when you're ready to put the top on. But we have to prepare the top. So we'll get back to the Wenge and start cutting 4 pieces that will form the shape of a W. I'm going to start with a substrate, a base plate made of 2 plates of mahogany. We'll put the tracing over that and to score that tracing on the mahogany plate so that the outline is really clear. So you can see the W shape on the mahogany. And these 2 nice plates of Wenge will be used to make the 4 separate pieces that make the W. Draw it out, carve it, sand it, draw it out, carve it, sand it, draw it again, carve it, sand it, and then you can start gluing things up. This will be a little outsized plate. This plate will be a little bit larger than is necessary, and the part that I don't need we'll cut off later. And the reason I make it large is so that when I put it in position for gluing, I can tack down those two little tacks on the outside and keep that board in position on the plate. The plate does have a center line for index and for reference. Now that one first part of the W shape is dry, I can sort of use it as a thing to glue up against, so that piece I just put on that clamping caul is pushing up against that first part of the W shape. So this is the A, B, C, D. This is the B part. Put a clamping caul on top with packing tape on the face of it so it doesn't stick. And finally get to the fourth segment of the W shape. Put a clamping caul on top and a couple of bar clamps to squeeze it up against the segment to its left. Put some spreaders on there and some tension spreaders and a couple of cam clamps. Now that it's all done, I can check it for fit and marvel at it, and then get ready to glue it up on the body blank. Drill a bunch of pilot holes that I'll use to screw that thing into position so that it's in the correct position and stays there when I glue it down. Once again, I use that thing a lot. I make the bodies kind of outsized, and I don't cut the body profile until later in the game, so that I can use the outer edges that will get sawn off to position various parts of the instrument together. It makes it just a lot easier to deal with assembly. I get out the old cam clamps, start applying pressure all the way around, and again, this is just wood glue, so I try to leave it for about a day to dry. Now it's time to make the neck pocket. So this is a critical time. I got to get to find the absolute center of the neck on both ends, at the heel and at the nut, and use those indices to establish where the neck will sit on the instrument. But since it's not able to sit in the instrument, I have to be sure that I position it correctly. Making a router template is key. You get this little router template made, and I'll put a couple of ramps on the template so that the router rides on an angle as it's cutting the neck pocket. And this will allow the neck to sit back a little bit as it joins the guitar and allow the strings to shoot up over the top of the instrument and land at the bridge area at about 0.7 inches above the instrument on the bridge. That's the target height at the bridge for the strings. I'll hog off a bunch of the material inside the pocket area. Makes it easier to do the routing operation. Then the router ends up going lower than those Forstner bit cutouts. So there's the router template in action. Now that the pocket is cut, the neck pocket is cut, I can cut off these two excess sort of wings in the top end of the guitar. Set the neck in there to check and see if I got the center line correct, and it looks good. I can start cutting off excess parts of the the body assembly, using a push stick so that I retain all of my fingers. Now we'll do a little countersink for the neck ferrules. These are just fancy little chrome metal cups that will house the screws that hold the neck on. 5 little ferrule countersinks. Drill a hole through the body and the tail end for the jack that will connect the instrument to an amplifier, and then run a router across all the ledges, all the outside areas, and create ledges for binding. I'm using Padauk for the binding. It's a nice reddish accent against the dark brown Wenge. Put it on with CA glue. Using butt joints for most of them, which look fine. And the finished instrument, you can't really see them. And then do a 45-degree chamfer on all the edges and soften them up a little bit with some 320 sandpaper. Now it's time for the tail piece, the string retainer. This chunk of aluminum will be fastened to the end of the instrument, and the strings will be located there. They'll be held into place on the guitar. I use woodworking methods for working metal, and it shows. Check the string for the size of hole that I'm going to need for string access. Drill those holes, countersink them nicely, and then you got to clean this aluminum up. Check the screws, make sure I got the countersinks right. It'll look okay. And then just use a sanding block and clean up that chunk of aluminum. Get all the edges off, round over the edges, get all the burrs off, countersink them a little bit, and then go to a sanding stick and take it down to about 320 with that before I get ready to put a little brown rouge on the polishing wheel and polish the aluminum so that it gets nice and shiny. Aluminum is interesting. It shines up real nice. This probably doesn't look all that great, but it actually looks really good once you get on a buffing wheel. Now it's time for the bridge. I just use a little piece of U-channel aluminum. It's real kind of light duty stuff. Cut off the excess on the top. Clean it up on the sander. Once again, woodworking skills with metal. Clean up those little swoops at the end, those little scoops. Beautiful little scoops. I'm going to take off all the burrs and with a sanding stick. Try to round over those little edges so you don't cut your wrists wide open as you're trying to entertain people with your bass guitar. Check it for fit. Just make sure I got it right. Now we'll make saddles. The saddles are made out of aluminum bar. Turn the saw blade to 45. Fix that chunk of aluminum into that wooden block there and then pass it through the saw. Aluminum saws pretty well. You get a 45-degree edge there, and then we can cut five little blocks, one spare. I need 4. Wedge them into this little holder and put them, once again, woodworker style, on the disc sander and get them all to the same shape, same size. Check them for fit to make sure that they're about the right width to enable the 4 strings to land where they're supposed to land. Then wedge them into the nascent bridge, which isn't quite finished yet. And then you can drill the hole all the way through for each saddle. You can drill through the bridge blank and through the saddle. They're all marked for position, so they'll go back into the right position. And I tap them 440 and check for fit. I'll put them together on the bridge itself. You can see it's all buffed out now, and you can see how the saddles will move back and forth with these little 440 screws. It's kind of a clunky looking bridge, but it works like $1,000,000, and it's very adjustable and it's great. Now for a pickup holder, this little stage is going to be the thing upon which the pickup can rise up and down. It'll be installed inside the guitar. So I saw a chunk of 0.10 aluminum. Drill it and tap it for the 3 holes that correspond in the pickup. And then that little aluminum thing gets epoxied inside the bass. And the 3 screws that hold the pickup engage with it with a little spring in between, which enables the pickup to rise up and down and stay, solid. And there's our little epoxied in pickup stage, a little screw stage. Never more to come out. It's getting close to finishing time now. The whole body's done. We do finish sanding down to 320. Take all the edges off of the peg head. So round it over. Mask off the neck. I don't want any finish on the neck. And I'll put a little handle on the guitar in the neck slot. And I'm using shellac in a rattle can. It's kind of a really quick and dirty way to finish, but it works pretty well. I use other much more sophisticated things, but I didn't want to do that. So I just used rattle can, and it looks great. This is actually a satin lacquer that I used. It's just a run-of-the-mill product you can find at the hardware store. And it looks pretty funky going on, but this stuff looks really great at the end. See how that finish looks nice. You can see a piece of copper in the tailpiece holder with a white wire coming out. That's the ground strap for the strings. Drill a couple of holes for the potentiometers. There they are, pre-wired. I did a little wiring on them off of the instrument. Now I can insert this semi-wired thing. Get the pickup installed, run the pickup wire through, fasten the jack plate on, run the wires for that into the cavity, and then solder everything up. I'm not great at soldering. I solder like a farmer. No disrespect to farmers, but my soldering skills are... I could never work in high tech. Let's just put it that way. Close up the little cavity there. Drill a screw hole for the strap pin. Finish up the tailpiece with a strap pin. You like my tailpiece? I like that tailpiece. I think that thing looks cool. And put the tuners on. It's always fun to get to this point where you can put all this hardware on. It's like, finally, I can put this hardware on. It's becoming, it's getting alive. Tighten those puppies down. Take the masking off and run some tung oil up and down the flamey walnut, the curly walnut. Make the curliness look more curly. Then use bone for my nut. This is cow bone that you get from the pet store. It's better than spending $50 on bone nuts from supply store. Keep sanding it and sizing it until it fits the slot real good. And then score the 4 locations for the strings and file the 4 string slots with the proper gauge files. Put on the truss rod nut. Fit the neck. Put the 5 screws in. Don't need really 5 screws. It's really more of a kind of a decorative thing. Looks cool. And then start stringing up and finding out how wrong you were about everything that you did so far. You have to start slotting and, cutting slots in the bridge, raising and lowering the bridge, deepening the slots in the nut. I even put a little wedge underneath the neck at the end to try to get the angle of the neck a little less. Tightening the truss rod screw to try to get the stress out of the neck, or straighten the neck a little bit so that the action is ideal. Once all of that is done, I put the little pins in that will that the bridge will rest on, and these little knurled what do they call them? Knurled nuts will enable you to raise and lower the bridge. And there it is. That thing is done. Now, a couple of studio shots. My last name is Whitehouse, which is why I wanted to make a W-shaped guitar. This was a really fun project to build. It took about 180 hours over 33 days. Parts and materials are about $175. And thanks for watching this video.